and I'm co-editor-in-chief of Boston Review, along with Deb Chasman. And on behalf of Boston Review, I'm really delighted to welcome everybody to this afternoon's event celebrating the life and work of Charles Mills. I knew Charles for about 25 years, thought he was really a lovely human being and learned a great deal from him. I included a selection from his wonderful book, The Racial Contract, in the Norton Introduction to Philosophy, and was supposed to see him in mid-September at a conference on the 50th anniversary of Rawls's A Theory of Justice, but then sadly he passed away really just before the meeting. And we all at the meeting felt his influence, but very much missed his compelling presence. So Charles never wrote for Boston Review, but we care about lots of the same things. So through a series of conversations with my friend and sometimes co-teacher and Berkeley colleague, Desmond Jagmohan, we decided to put together this remarkable group of scholars who knew Charles and were touched by him personally and intellectually. Des is going to be moderating. He teaches political science at Berkeley, specializes in the history of African American and American political thought, writes about the politics of deception, about theories of property, slavery, and domination, and the ideas of nationalism and self-determination in Black political thought. He's finishing a book now on Booker T. Washington's tragic realism, about really the politics of deception under Jim Crow, and also working on a second book on the political thought of Harriet Jacobs. Now, our mission at Boston Review is to try to make democracy better by convening serious discussions on the most fundamental topics. And we do it in print with books like Redesigning AI or Thinking in a Pandemic or Climate Action, or our most recent one went to the printer just yesterday on Uncertainty with a lead from Sheila Jasanoff. We do it online at bostonreview.net, and we do it in events like this one. Des, with so many thanks to you and Bob and Falguni and Derrick and Tommy for joining us today. Let me hand it over to you.
Thanks, Josh and Maria, for organizing the event and for hosting it. And thank you to the panelists for agreeing. I'm just going to introduce the speakers in the order they're going to speak in. And first is Professor Derrick Darby. He's the Henry Rutgers Professor of Philosophy at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. He works in social and political philosophy and writes about rights, inequality, and democracy. His most recent co-authored book is The Color of Mind: Why the Origins of the Achievement Gap Matter for Justice. Next is Robert Gooding Williams, and here I must say, when we were thinking about what it is we should do in memory of Charles Mills, Bob was the one that suggested a panel and a discussion, and in particular these names. So this event is really indebted to Bob. Gooding Williams is the M. Moran Weston Black Alumni Council Professor of African American Studies and Diaspora Studies, as well as philosophy at Columbia University. His areas of research and teaching interest include social and political philosophy, the history of African American political thought, 19th century European philosophy, existentialism, and aesthetics. He is, of course, the author of several books, including the award-winning and quite influential In the Shadow of Du Bois. Next is Falguni A. Sheth. She's a professor of political philosophy of race and feminist critical security studies. Currently associate professor in women, gender, and sexuality studies at Emory University. And she's the author of Toward a Political Philosophy of Race. Her next book, Unruly Women, Race, Neocolonialism, and the Hijab, is forthcoming in January. Finally is Tommy Shelby, the Caldwell Titcomb Professor of African American Studies and Philosophy at Harvard University. He is the author of Dark Ghettos, Injustice, Dissent, and Reform, which won the 2018 David and Elaine Spitz Prize for the best book in liberal and/or democratic theory, and the 2016 Book Award from the North American Society for Social Philosophy. Thank you to each of them, and we're going to go ahead and start with Professor Darby.
I guess. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this wonderful opportunity to remember the great Charles Mills. I prepared just some brief remarks. With the passing of my dear friend, Charles Mills, we lost one of the two most important and certainly most influential political philosophers of our time. The other, John Rawls, would have been 100 years old if he were still alive. Eventually, if not now, philosophers will make two distinctions: political philosophy before and after John Rawls's A Theory of Justice, and political philosophy before and after Charles Mills's The Racial Contract. Just as philosophers have made careers engaging with Rawls and situating their work in relationship to Rawls, philosophers will make careers engaging with Mills and situating their work in relationship to Mills. His work will also continue to be required reading in political philosophy courses and courses on race, racism, and white supremacy. Indeed, if I were compelled to teach only 3 philosophy books for the remainder of my teaching career, in addition to A Theory of Justice and The Racial Contract, I would add Plato's Republic to my syllabus. Charles Mills was much more than a giant of contemporary philosophy. He was a model humanist. Reading his writing, whether it took the form of a book, article, or one of his famous handouts, and listening to him speak was especially edifying because he treated us to so much more than what philosophy on its own has to offer. He taught us lessons from many other disciplines in the humanities. I got to know Charles well when we both lived in Chicago. He taught at the University of Illinois at Chicago Circle, and I taught at Northwestern. Back then and over the years, our most stimulating conversations were not about Rawls or intramural debates in political philosophy. In fact, unless we were on stage together or separately giving or attending a talk, we talked very little about philosophy. We talked instead about history, literature, law, sociology, economics, psychology, and the like. And when we had time, we talked for hours. When I was a young assistant professor, I sometimes found myself at a loss for how to integrate the reading I was doing on Black history and the history of race and racism into philosophical writing that had to engage with debates, questions, and problems more familiar to mainstream philosophers. Charles once asked me, "So, Professor Darby," as he would say, "what do you believe?" I believe that how we think about the nature and value of what rights we have and about what being a right holder amounts to philosophically should be informed by the lived experience of Black people and others whose status has been denied and unrecognized throughout American history. Although he disagreed with the theoretical conclusion I drew from the evidence, namely that all rights are rooted in social practices of recognition, he fully encouraged my efforts to read widely outside of philosophy to make my case. Charles was always eager to discuss whatever pro-slavery track I dug up, arguing that Blacks were not fully human or were not persons. And he was eager to discuss works like George Friedrichsen's The Black Image in the White Mind and the evidence that such works supply. There were few senior philosophers I could have these conversations with early in my career. The other, also a dear friend and a former colleague at Northwestern, is on this panel, Robert Gooding Williams. Mills was not the first philosopher to see value in bringing other sources of theorizing. However, he gave us a template for how Afro-analytic philosophers and Africana philosophers more broadly could do this insightfully and productively to deepen our thinking about injustice, inequality, exploitation, and the like. And we are forever in his debt. Mills would sometimes say that he was not against abstraction as such in political philosophy. only against abstracting away from the realities of social oppression that characterize the lived experiences of people of color, and doing so in a way that inhibits unearthing conceptual tools needed to dismantle and rectify these realities. His methodological commitment to doing non-ideal theory was about understanding these realities, taking them into account, and appreciating the direction they suggested for how to radicalize liberal political philosophy so that it could be a real force for radical social transformation. Future generations will argue about whether Mills's efforts to redeem and radicalize liberalism have been successful. Some may even deny that they were necessary, criticizing him for having too much faith in the prospect of redeeming liberalism. Philosophers cannot do non-ideal theory, and certainly cannot do it well, if they remain in their caves, narrowly focused on works written by and for other philosophers. To take in the realities of race, racism, and white supremacy that come to life in Mills's work, one has to read broadly in other humanistic disciplines. Unfortunately, graduate training in philosophy and our professionalization processes and structures do not typically support or reward such work. And Mills would be the first to tell us that we need to do better on this score. I don't have time to detail our philosophical disagreements, but we'll conclude with a final memory that sums up one point of contention between us. Charles Mills was a very, very funny person, hilarious, in fact. I remember telling him how I was challenging his attempt to vindicate a Black radical liberalism. I summarized the argument I was making. In keeping with the Millsian practice of reading widely outside of philosophy and bringing the work to bear on philosophy, my argument drew on reading I was doing in social psychology about race and about motivated reasoning. Mills was really good with titles. One of my favorite was a paper he wrote on environmental racism called Black Trash. I bounced my article off of him. I ended up calling the article Charles Mills's Liberal Redemption Song. Having discerned my effort to challenge his radicalism by wading into deeper non-ideal waters, he said, "I have a better title for your paper, Derrick. You should call it De-Idealize This, Motherfucker." We both had a gut-busting laugh. I was pleased that he got the gist of my criticism. I last spoke with Charles just weeks before he passed away. We reminisced and had some laughs. He asked me if I was calling to make one final devastating criticism of his work and to tell him again why his criticism of my work failed. I told him that in addition to going down in history as the Rawls Slayer, he would be remembered for the great body of work that he leaves behind to inspire and challenge future generations of philosophers. And holding back tears, I thanked him for how much he had inspired me and supported my career as a professional philosopher. It is an honor to take part in this event to remember my dear friend, Charles Mills, a true giant of philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Darby. It was very moving, and many of us have those memories of him. So we're going to turn now to Robert Gooding Williams.
Okay, thanks. So I want to begin by thanking Jagmohan and Josh Cohen for organizing this conversation and for inviting me to participate in it. And I want to say that I am delighted to be in conversation with Tommy, Derrick, and Falguni about the scholarship and intellectual legacy of Charles Mills. In what follows, I'll say just a little about the history of my relationship with Charles, after which I'll say a few words in response to a question that Des posed to me when he first broached the possibility of participating in a Boston Review-sponsored conversation to honor Charles's work. I'll conclude with a few remarks regarding the impact of Charles's work on my Du Bois scholarship. So let me begin by noting that I first met Charles when, in my capacity as chair of the APA Committee on Blacks, I organized an Eastern Division session on the racial contract shortly after it was published, sometime in the late 1990s. I remember that Sally Hatzlinger was one of the commentators, and so too, I think, was Lucius Outlaw. So as you might imagine, knowing those folks, the exchange was spirited and memorably laced with Charles's wit. After that, our paths crossed many times at conferences, workshops, and the like. And in 2009, 2010, we both served as members of the program committee of the APA Central Division. Later, when I was teaching at Northwestern and Charles at the University of Illinois, Chicago, we saw each other more often and not infrequently in the company of Derrick. Derrick's already alluded to this, not infrequently in the company of Derrick and Tom McCarthy, my colleagues then in the philosophy department at Northwestern. Our meetings were always great fun and intellectually generative for all of us. I could go on, for Charles and I co-edited an issue of the Du Bois Review just before I left Chicagoland. And after that, we had any number of professional interactions. When I think of the larger trajectory of our conversations, however, from the late 1990s to his recent death, what I remember most is Charles's stalwart and intense commitment to transforming professional philosophy, both to promoting the work of other philosophers of color and to securing an institutional place within the profession for critical race theory broadly understood. In these efforts, Charles was indefatigable, and we are all very much in his debt. So let me turn now to the question Des posed, really a comment more than a question. Des wrote, and I quote him, "One thing I've always found puzzling about Charles's work, and had mentioned him a few times, is that he spent his whole career mostly writing about what Anglo-American political philosophy misses about race, rather than what African-American political philosophy has repeatedly gotten right about race, Douglas, Du Bois, Wells, King, etc." So I've given Des's puzzle some thought, for it is a puzzle that has also occurred to me. And in what follows, I suggest a solution to the puzzle. Consider then in this connection, Charles's explanation of his project in the introduction to the racial contract. The theory of the racial contract, he writes, and now I'm quoting, "The theory of the racial contract is intended as a conceptual bridge between two areas now largely segregated from each other. On the one hand, the world of mainstream, i.e. white ethics and political philosophy, preoccupied with discussions of justice and rights in the abstract. On the other hand, the world of Native American, African American, and third and fourth world political thought, historically focused on issues of conquest, imperialism, colonialism, white settlement, land rights, race and racism, slavery, Jim Crow, reparations, apartheid, cultural authenticity, natural identity, forgive the pronunciation, indigenismo, Afrocentrism, etc. These, I'm still quoting, these issues hardly appear in mainstream political philosophy, but they have been central to the political struggles of the majority of the world's population. Their absence from what is considered serious philosophy is a reflection not of their lack of seriousness, but of the color of the vast majority of Western academic philosophers, and perhaps their lack of seriousness." End of quotation. Africana philosophy, including what Des calls African American political philosophy, is but a small part of the world of political thought occupying one side of the bridge that Charles undertook to build. But it is a part of that world, but it is a part of that world that he knew well, as is clear from his footnotes, which cite not only Wells or Ida Wells Barnett, Douglas, Du Bois, and other African-American thinkers, but in addition, and for example, Fanon, Césaire, and C.L.R. James. Charles's project of conceptual bridge building, of translating between two areas of philosophical thought, was meant, I believe, to render legible and intelligible to the world of mainstream white philosophy at least some of the key insights stemming from the thought of Africana, Native American, and third and fourth world political thought. This, I think, explains his decision to adopt the idiom of the social contract as his medium of translation. In some sense, then, Charles was always writing about what African-American philosophy got right about race, but interpreting what it got right in terms familiar to his mainstream target audience, thus in terms that might convince his mainstream audience that maybe, just maybe, it had missed something about race. As my Columbia colleague Bashir Diong has recently argued, W.V.O. Quine represents the problem of radical translation in terms of an encounter between a native informant and his colonist interlocutor. Speaking figuratively and by rough analogy, we could say that the first step of Charles's polemical radical translation project was to render the native's philosophical insights in the language of early modern European political thought, the language that is of the social contract, thus to speak of a specifically racial contract. The second step was to use the theory of the racial contract to highlight the omissions, the silences that had typically punctuated the white colonizers' political thought, hoping thereby to transform that thought into what he, Charles, might consider serious philosophy. In addition, and here I come to my final point, Charles's ideal typical construct of a racial contract provided a useful framework for reconstructing the political thought of the Africana philosophers, in my case, Du Bois, whose insight inspired the construct in the first place. In my case, again, Charles's claim that the racial exclusions demanded by the racial contract have functioned as normative and not anomalous features of modern white supremacy proved useful for distinguishing the views of the early Du Bois, white supremacy as anomalous, from those of the later Du Bois, white supremacy as normative. My point here, put simply, is that the theory of the racial contract has served not only to build a conceptual bridge to mainstream political philosophy, but equally to illuminate the contours of the non-mainstream political thought from which it has taken its bearing. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob, very much for that piece. And to remind you, if you came in a bit late, I'm going to present next, and then Falguni, and then Tommy. So these brief remarks can be summed up as Mills in context. As some of you may know, Charles went from a heterodox Marxist to a reluctant, though radical liberal. Instead of charting this transformation, or for some, political regression, I want to consider the place of the Caribbean in his work. Radical theory, Caribbean reality is perhaps Charles's least known work. The volume is a mix of autobiographical essays, articles on Marxism, and reflections on Caribbean politics. Overall, it reveals a side of Mills few of us know. The political anthropologist, the wonderfully philosophical reader of popular fiction, and a quite pioneering scholar of Marxism. Charles was a child of the Windrush generation. His parents met in 1948 on a ship from Jamaica to England. And 3 years later, they had Charles in London. That same year, the solidly middle-class Jamaican family returned home. His father, Gladstone, one of those very Caribbean names, became a professor at the University of the West Indies, and his mother, Winifred, served as the president of the island's WYCA. Growing up on campus sheltered Charles from the neo-colonial realities faced by the island's majority Black population, he said. He also recalled that he had little interest in philosophy or politics as a young man. In fact, he majored in physics, which he later taught at the local technical college. His political awakening came in 1968. Whenever Mills reflected on the Caribbean as either home or history, two events often take center stage. The first is the Rodney Affair. In 1968, Walter Rodney returned to Jamaica to teach African history at his alma mater, University of the West Indies. Rodney was committed to the role of a revolutionary intellectual, someone grounded in the ongoing struggle of the people. So he began teaching Black power beyond campus. He met with the people on the streets, He sat in the government yards of Kingston. That October, Professor Rodney traveled to the Black Writers Conference in Montreal. While at the conference, the Jamaican government expelled him from the country, officially accusing him of seditious activities, an utterly unfounded charge. Of course, Rodney went on to write how Europe underdeveloped Africa, but on June 13, 1980, he was assassinated in his and my native country, Guyana. Like many West Indians of that generation, the Rodney Affair was Mills's introduction to radical politics. In a quite brilliant chapter, Mills describes what he calls the Red Menace to the Green Island. Flexing his incredible range as a reader and writer, he offers a wonderfully insightful interpretation of three works of spy fiction on the communist threat to Jamaica. Ian Fleming's Dr. No, which of course became the first James Bond film. Leslie Charteris, The Black Commissar, part of his Simon Templar stories that all of us West Indians grew up on. And Fever Grass by Afro-Caribbean writers John Hearn and Morris Cagle. In each, the sinister threat took the form of someone who had combined Marxism and Black power. Recall that in the 1970s, many Caribbean governments had banned books on Black power, including the seminal texts by Carmichael and Hamilton, who were not really Marxist. 1970s Jamaica or Guyana was closer to 1960s America, Mills argues. His crucial point, however, is that the region saw the radical Black tradition as a political and social threat. You might think that the radical works we teach gave birth to the independence movements of the era, but that is not quite the truth. Rather, they revealed a fundamental lie. They showed that these newly post-colonial states were not self-determining nations, but neo-colonial shells. The broader Cold War context certainly shaped how these states responded to radical Black intellectuals of the time, but also elides what was really at stake. That was Charles's point of revealing what he wanted to reveal in these early articles. The second event occurred in 1983. That year, the Grenada Revolution imploded when the party executed Maurice Bishop. For Mills, both events revealed a fundamental failure of Marxists to confront the distinctive challenges the history of racial slavery and colonialism had thrown up. These failures were especially acute in the Caribbean, which witnessed repeated collapse of Marxist movements into brutal dictatorships. But like C.L.R. James, Walter Rodney, and Bishop, Mills also looked to Marxism for political and philosophical answers. So in 1973, a decade before the Grenada debacle, he won a Commonwealth Fellowship to pursue graduate work in philosophy at the University of Toronto. There, he wrote a dissertation on the Marxist concept of ideology and the role of revolutionary intellectuals. On the one hand, Mills recognized that Marxism held the only real possibility for radical change in the region. On the other, he came to believe that for Marxism to address race, it would have to be radically reimagined. Charles, as many of you know, went on to hold jobs in philosophy at the University of Oklahoma, University of Illinois, Chicago, or Circle, Northwestern University, and the CUNY Graduate Center. He later recalled that some philosophers may be able to say they were drawn to philosophy from the start, but I couldn't say that myself. I could have done a number of things. Perhaps that explains one of the many virtues of his work, one of which Professor Darby spoke to earlier, that unlike so many social and political philosophers, he always started and ended with questions of power and politics, someone who read broadly and deeply. So let me end with a story Charles recalled. In 1990, he moved from the University of Oklahoma to UIC, which was a top 20 department. Some of you may know this story. Nervous about being in the big leagues, he stayed up reading philosophy journals and periodicals about academic life, including Lingua Franca. In the April 1991 issue, he read an article titled "The Candidate." It was written from the perspective of a search committee member in an English department in a Midwestern university that had just made an affirmative action hire. The author, one G. Kindro, worried that the job ad was in bad faith since white candidates had no chance of being hired. Charles read the article a few times, soon realizing it was really about him, and that the author's name is really an anagram for G. Dworkin, his senior colleague in the department and then editor of ethics. Dworkin had even left a copy of the article in his mailbox saying, "Charles, you might find this interesting." It turned out that several senior colleagues knew about the article when Charles confronted them, so a few months later, Charles responded under an anagram, Michael S. Wardell. Charles said the first 15 minutes of fame he had was being introduced to the world as an anonymous and somewhat undeserving affirmative action hire. Quote, "I felt naked, unprotected, at the focal point of the white panopticon, the object of scrutiny from all. I suspect this feeling helps explain why Charles had always gone out of his way to be a source of kindness, affirmation, and support for so many young scholars of color and women working in disciplines that remain unbearably white and male. His passing has ushered in an unbelievable void. I imagine the best way to honor his memory is to be for others what he has been for so many of us. Decent, kind, and yes, funny as hell." Thank you. We'll now turn to Falguni.
Wonderful. It's lovely to be here with you all today, and I'm appreciating the stories that you all are sharing. I don't really have, I'm not very good at telling personal stories, but I will say that Charles was a mentor and a very good friend, and we met at a SPEP conference in Boston in 2003, around the time that I was considering leaving the profession. I had just finished a dissertation. I had been at the New School in philosophy, and I decided there was no space for me. And I met him and a number of other colleagues. And he and I left the conference one afternoon, and we walked around Boston Common for hours, 4 or 5 hours. Walked around the environs and talked about the state of the so-called field and his work and my hopes, and how peculiar it was that his amazing, remarkable writings were receiving so little attention back then. And so it seems kind of fitting then to talk about his work in this context today, especially in terms of the enormous impact his work has had. And I hope that through my kind of thinking much more formally about some of the concepts that I think he's introduced to political philosophy, I'll be able to share what he meant to me. Although I will say, I've attended a number of memorials for Charles over the last, since his passing. And given how many people have been affected by his kindness, his generosity, how many conversations people have had with him, I'm kind of amazed that he had any time to write at all. I'm wondering when he got anything written, especially given how prolific he was. So he was quite the mark of the efficient, in addition to a very profound thinker. And so I do want to say that I want to focus more about the impact of some of his earlier work has had both on me and I think the so-called profession, but also not just, and the multiple audiences to which his work speaks. So not just professional philosophers and scholars, but also to the uninitiated, the students. And the ways in which, having taught his work over the last 2 decades, and having taught it at multiple different institutions until I arrived at Emory, to see the remarkable ways in which just different generations of students have received his work. And in fact, I taught it this semester in critical race theory, which was on the books before it became a subject of contention here in Georgia and elsewhere. And there is this remarkable light of recognition that students, I find, have when they read his work, where it suddenly gives them a certain vocabulary, a certain tool by which to start to think analytically about the environment in which they are studying and thinking and engaging as members of the polity. And I think that was very similar for me as well. And so I just want to kind of focus on a couple of different aspects of his work. The first aspect is no surprise to anyone, I'm sure, in this audience, but really the implications of his writings on the racial contract. And the idea that he was able to insist and articulate that the racial contract was, and I'll just quote, the formal agreement made between whites, to which non-whites are forced to be party, such that they have a subordinate civil standing in the white or white ruled polities the whites already inhabit or establish. Seems like such a kind of technical definition, and yet it was earth-shattering. Earth-shattering because it allowed for the possibility of talking about the intuitions that those of us who are political philosophers who study 17th, 18th, 19th century social contract theory were finally able to grasp onto, to think about it not just as a kind of historical actuality, but which also underpins the last, as he said, the last 500 years of the realities of European domination. And so, at least for me, to be able to kind of to talk about that as codifying a certain set of moral and political institutions, legal institutions within its boundaries, gave a certain possibility of discussing race as a legitimate area of inquiry for those of us who even were in continental philosophy programs in the 1990s, where race was not an acceptable category of discussion and was actually considered to be not real philosophy. And so for many of us, myself, especially as an immigrant kid, as a woman of color, I wanted so much to be accepted by philosophers. And so really stayed away from this work until stayed away from philosophy of race until I came across Charles's work. And I think the ability, the remarkable implications of his writings on the racial contract, especially the idea that it is global, allowed those of us who were not necessarily writing or part of the Black-white binary, which is so marked the history of US race discourse, were able to participate and expand and to think about it in ways that allowed us to move the state of at least certain aspects of political philosophy in certain directions. And I think one of the ways in which that occurs is his amplification and his formalizing of the notion of white supremacy. To think about white supremacy as a technical professional category. Sorry, not professional, but a philosophical category, a category of analysis, and not something which is relegated to thinking about extremist groups, certain kinds of outliers, but to think about white supremacy as a term which marks a kind of history of liberal institutions. And as he says in 2003 in a companion to African-American philosophy in an essay called White Supremacy, says it's a term that has traditionally been used to denote the domination of whites over non-whites. And he says in mainstream social theory, it's usually restricted to formal juridico-political domination, slavery, Jim Crow, Black disenfranchisement, apartheid. But by actually drawing upon critical race theorists, and he argues he never takes credit for the term, but he does develop it by arguing that it's de facto. It exists in a range of institutions that continue to this day, politically, culturally, institutionally, and juridically. and I won't get into it too much, but this is part of what allows, for example, my students to watch the Ahmaud Arbery case here in Georgia and to recognize that what is at work there in a jury selection of 11 whites and 1 Black, what is at work there to have a district attorney who refused to file charges against 3 men who decided to make a citizen's arrest based on no evidence whatsoever, to dismiss charges, that these are not exceptions, that they're not the work of racism just as a habit of the heart, but actually endemic to legal and jurisprudential institutions. And I think that's something that is a kind of remarkable impact that is subtle and far-reaching. The third term that I just want to kind of bring up here, again, in his early work, is the epistemology of ignorance, which really gave, I mean, it's such a beautiful, very Charles-like oxymoron, right? The epistemology of ignorance, which really was taken up by scholars across the field, and especially feminist philosophers, who recognized this notion, the world, he says, that whites are unable to understand the world that they themselves have made. And to think about the kinds of allowances that many of us are given to not remember, to not acknowledge, to not attend to different aspects of racism as an institution that many of us, in fact, many of us are party to and complicit in. And so it took off, especially for feminist theorists, but many others. And it's become the basis by which to, as a matter of fact, to think about, those who are now kind of named in media as Karens, right? Or other kinds of racially divisive interactions. So he gives us a term. And so this is part of, I think, the brilliance of Charles's work, is that he's not only intensely profound, but very funny and wry as he talks about these kinds of terms and argues for their institutionalization in philosophy itself. I will just say this much more. I think also his insistence that race, I mean, this is, a given for everyone here, but I just want to draw attention to some basic ideas that race is a central category of analysis in political ontology, which he consciously extricates and discusses in Blackness Visible, in an essay called Revisionist Ontologies. And he says, what would happen? He says, for mainstream first world philosophy, political philosophy, race barely exists. The silence is located in a kind of exclusionary theoretical dynamic, in that the presuppositions of the world of mainstream theory offer no ready point of ingress, no conceptual entree for the issues of race, culture, and indeity that typically preoccupy much of Black and third world theory. So he asks, and again, this may be basic, but I think it stands to disappear. What happens if we place race at center stage rather than in the wings of theory, which is really so much of what characterizes, for me, the profundity of his work. And his analogy is feminist philosophers who he read and decided to draw upon the analog of gender as a central category of analysis, and especially Carol Pateman's Sexual Contract. And I guess the thing that I'll end on is, the idea that I'll end on is the possibilities that his work enables for us today, both in terms of political philosophy, in terms of critical race theory, in terms of feminist critical philosophy of race, to expand the ability to talk about race as a technical category with regard to race beyond the nation state, to think about how white supremacy is a global, ubiquitous global and political system. And that is profound, to facilitate our ability to talk about race, even in terms of international engagements, rather than often shifting to a much more comfortable language of xenophobia, which takes away from the deeply embedded, divisive dynamic that race has in terms of questions of foreign intervention, in terms of current moments of empire, which are revisited, and to allow philosophers of race especially to apply his work to consider global supremacy, but also outside of a black-white binary, and to kind of move beyond just adding racial identity in an ad hoc manner. And so I think I'll stop there. I mean, his work has really become this, it has been since the beginning, the central underpinning of my own writing in the first book and also in this book that's coming out, to think about just the camouflage of deep racial ontologies within neutral, liberal, legal, jurisprudential, and political structures. So thank you for letting me share that.
Thank you, Falguni. So now let's turn to, certainly last but not least, Professor Tommy Shelby.
Thanks so much. I'm very glad to be here with you all. Many of our remarks will echo what others have said, but maybe I'll say a few things that to kind of round out some things that have been raised. So I've been learning from and I've followed Charles Mills's work for really more than 25 years. I first discovered his writings in the early 90s when I was writing my dissertation, which was not unlike Mills's on Marxism and morality. I found Mills's papers on Marx really incredibly enlightening. Learned articles on ideology and historical materialism in particular, I learned from. The scholarship I found to be impeccable, writing just clear, precise arguments to develop with just enormous care. And he really seemed to anticipate, all the objections I could think of on these topics. And so these virtues, they led me to search for his other work. And I found two pleasant surprises. The first was that Mills was Black. This is the 90s, so you couldn't just Google folk then, And second, in addition to Marxism, he wrote about race and Black life. These discoveries meant the world to me, as you might imagine. They were sources of inspiration, of pride, of encouragement. An intrepid, bold, Black analytic philosopher working on precisely the questions that I was most passionate about. As I was gaining my footing in this strange, sometimes frustrating, but yet I still think wonderful world of philosophy, to learn that I had this comrade in Charles Mills was just what I needed. And this was a gift that was made even more precious once I got to know the man himself, who was kind, generous, loyal, and as others have mentioned, incredibly funny. Charles was a mentor, an unfailing supporter, as good a colleague as anyone would want. He wrote countless recommendation letters for me. He invited me to participate in numerous projects he was engaged in. He graciously wrote blurbs for my books. But setting those things aside, he was also a cherished and dear friend. And we had some truly remarkable times together over the years. Charles and I also had some philosophical disagreements, even in print, as some assembled here know. Those disagreements were mostly about the value of John Rawls's writings on justice and about the role of ideal theory in political philosophy. I won't dwell on those disagreements here, not only because it wouldn't really be appropriate on this occasion, but also because I think those disagreements, though real, can easily obscure a broader philosophical orientation that I believe we both shared. One way to bring out this shared philosophical outlook is to consider Mills's essays assembled in the book From Class to Race, Essays in White Marxism and Black Radicalism, which was published in 2003. These essays reveal changes in Mills's philosophical orientation, away from core problems in orthodox Marxism and toward a project of developing a critical race theory in the Black radical tradition. Mills makes clear that the methods of analytic philosophy are not inherently bourgeois, as many radicals have supposed. As I think he shows, these techniques can be usefully applied to problems that concern leftists, even those who focus primarily on issues of race. He also shows that one can fruitfully draw on the traditions of Marxism, Black nationalism, and liberalism to develop an adequate social theory and political philosophy that has contemporary import. In fact, this project has been my own now for the last 20 years or so, and my own work owes much to Mills's trailblazing efforts. Most of my disagreements with Mills concern which elements from these three traditions we ought to preserve, reconstruct, or reject, and how exactly we should interpret the core tenets of these traditions. In his earliest essays, Mills offered a revisionist interpretation of the Marxist concept of ideology. He argued that Marx and Engels used the concept solely for purposes of attacking the idealist belief that ideas were the primary causal determinants in shaping social development. Relying on this interpretation, Mills sought to dissolve a familiar paradox in Marx's amoralism. So Marx, on his view, can consistently claim that morality is ideological in a negative sense, and that capitalism is unjust, provided we understand the claim about moral ideology not as a claim about the objectivity or justifiability of moral judgments, but about the ineffectiveness of moral suasion to bring about radical social change. Mills also critiqued G.A. Cohen's technological determinist interpretation of historical materialism. He mounted powerful textual evidence to show that, contrary to Cohen's influential contention, Marx means to include both productive forces and relations of production within the category of material factors, so that historically contingent social developments, in particular coordinated resistance, can play a crucial role in fundamental social change. In the early 90s, Mills moved away from these classic questions in Marx's theory to tackle the vexing race-class nexus. This work includes an insightful review essay that offers a Marxist critique of recent neo-Weberian analyses of the ghetto poor, the so-called urban underclass. And there is the important essay, European Specters, which is not only one of his most provocative and sarcastic, but also the one that most clearly displays his departure from orthodox Marxist treatments of race. Mills argued that race should be understood not as mere ideology or false consciousness, but as a material reality that is the primary social force shaping the structure of modern societies. He insisted that, quote, it is perceived racial group interest, not class interest, that have been the most important motivator in shaping people's decision-making in the modern era. Racial self-identification and group solidarity have generally trumped other identities and group belongings. In these transitional writings, which Mills further developed his new approach to race, an approach that he maintained has its roots in the neglected Black radical tradition. Following such Black thinkers and organizers like Martin Delany, Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, Mills urged that we analyze problems of race within a theoretical framework that treats global white supremacy as a socio-political system in its own right, just as Marxists regard capitalism and feminists regard patriarchy. Moreover, following the mainstream of the Black nationalist tradition, he maintained, quote, it is politically illuminating to see whites in the United States as ruling as a group, thus constituting the ruling race of what was originally, and is in some ways still, a Herrenvolk democracy. From Class to Race closes with a reply to a critique of the racial contract by the philosopher Jorge Garcia. Mills explained that contrary to Garcia's characterization, the racial contract theory is not a social scientific hypothesis about the origins of racial domination. It is rather a methodological stance within political philosophy. The racial contract trope is not to be taken literally, but rather is an attempt to exploit a familiar idea from liberal theory to reveal the centrality of racial domination in modern life, a tragic history that Mills claimed is too often evaded or glossed over by mainstream political philosophers. He further argued that we should operate with a social ontology that replaces the idea of raceless individuals standing in relations of equality with one that features socially constructed racial groups who face each other in asymmetric relations of power. So these theoretical shifts will, according to Mills, yield better prescriptions for handling questions of racial justice than traditional liberal contractarianism. So I could go on for hours about the many insights that I've found in Mills's books and articles. His enormous contributions to the philosophy of race and Africana philosophy are incredibly well-known, or increasingly well-known, I should say, and justly celebrated. But when I sort of step back and ask myself what from his work has meant the most to me, I guess two things stand out, and I'll make a brief comment about each. The first, as I've emphasized, is his intellectual journey from a fairly orthodox form of Marxism to Black radicalism. He sometimes described this shift as from white Marxism to Black radicalism, or from class to race. But as I see him, what he's doing here is developing the best in Marxism by drawing on wisdom from the Black radical tradition and Black folk culture more broadly. So it's not exactly about class versus race, but how to think through, and one hopes ultimately solve, the complex race-class conundrum. The second thing about his work that I most cherish is his sympathetic yet critical engagement with liberal thought. Though he explicitly identified with both critical race theory and Black radicalism, Mills believed that liberal theory still has much to teach us and is worth defending, at least in its more radical forms. Now, this stance is unfashionable among many radical thinkers, but Mills was undeterred, and rightly so, in my opinion. Now, of course, I don't agree with all the details of his Black radical liberalism, and I suppose now we're destined never to see eye to eye on ideal theory. But I will say that studying Mills's writings on liberal political philosophy have been really invaluable to me and have greatly impacted my thinking, and I really hope that this is evident in my work. Let me close with a brief word about the value of open intellectual disagreement among those working in Africana philosophy. The subfield is still fighting for standing and respect in philosophy, though we've made a lot of progress. And understandable solidarity among practitioners in Africana philosophy can make us somewhat reticent to publish critiques of each other's work. But I actually like to urge a greater critical engagement with each other's writings. I think this can be done with generosity, and charity, and respect. I think it can be driven not by personal rivalry or professional advancement, but out of a desire for mutual understanding and a genuine quest to try to figure out what to think about justice and Black life more generally. I like to believe that my critical exchanges with Charles made our work better, that they were learning experiences for us and maybe even for some others, even if in the end we didn't come to agreement. I don't believe that this engagement damaged our friendship really in any way. Indeed, in June of 2020, I received one of the most touching and flattering email messages I ever received from Charles. He was writing to ask me to write the foreword for the 25th anniversary edition of The Racial Contract. He gave as one of his reasons for why I would be the ideal person that we have had, quote, friendly disagreements. And I, of course, immediately said yes, honored to do it. And it has been a tremendous honor to write it and pay tribute to really a giant in our field, and to help others, I'd like to think, more people to read this contemporary classic. And though the man has, of course, sadly passed on, and we will definitely all miss him sorely, his work does live on, and we are immensely fortunate to have it. With that, I'll say thanks.
Thank you, Tommy, for those comments and for generating future criticism of your work, which will be good. So before turning to the questions of the audience, I kind of want to pose a question to the fellow panel members, and you can just jump in. Some of this is already, your answer to this may already be implicit in what you presented on or what you discussed. But when going back through Mills's work, I was just very struck by how much has been lost in the shadow of Rawls. Shelby just spoken about his Marxist writings, etc. I really did not know his Caribbean writings. And it was incredibly illuminating to also read his autobiographical stuff. So what in Charles's Over would you like people to consider or to teach that we generally have often kind of either don't know or ignore? Because while the racial contract is so important, I just think he, as a philosopher, was far more impactful than just that work.
I guess I could start briefly. I mean, I generally don't teach the racial contract in my courses. I generally teach the essays in Blackness Visible. So when I did a grad seminar in African American philosophy a few years ago, we just read a huge number of the essays in Blackness Visible. I partly choose that because I think the racial contract, though obviously a great work, is clearly a polemical work. It's clearly meant to be to shake up things, and it has its place, and it's great for introducing things to people who don't know a lot about political philosophy or about white supremacy and need a way into that. But I think for philosophers, especially those with a lot of experience in the field who've been studying political philosophy for a while, I think the essays in Blackness Visible are often more edifying and more, and they're written more for us, if I can put it that way. I mean, those of us who are already engaged with these questions and take them seriously already. And so it's easier to kind of engage with them because you feel like you are the audience.
Yeah, I would add to that when I taught Charles, I've also focused on the essays in Blackness Visible, in particular the essay on the racial polity, to which I think Falguni was alluding, where he articulates the importance of thinking of white supremacy as a global phenomenon, and then also the essay on the metaphysics of race, which is extremely rich and nuanced in the range of distinctions he draws. So yeah. So my experience in the classroom with Charles is similar to Tommy's, although I think with undergraduates, sometimes just introducing Charles via the racial contract has been helpful. But I think with more advanced students, the other essays have been more useful.
I mean, I heard your question maybe a bit differently. You were wondering what else we could teach of Charles that would offset the large emphasis on Rawls and his engagement with Rawls. But as I was thinking about that, I mean, yeah, I think you probably have to go to some of the work Tommy talked about, some of the very early work. But even then, he's setting up a way of thinking about the social contract tradition, broadly speaking, as a way of that, in a way that has been silent about race. And so I think that's just a short step to get to Rawls, which he takes to be a paradigm representative of that tradition. So I think your question is harder to answer, but on the teaching front, I said I would have the racial contract on my syllabus, in part for the reason Falguni gave, that I think for undergraduates, they get that book. It's a big idea book. And there's a lot that can be extracted from it, both having them think about traditional Western political philosophy, and also, now that we have seen his work develop, to pull out strands of his work that develop in more sophisticated ways later on, including in the Blackness Visible collection, which, like Tommy and Bob, I also think is my favorite collection. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you. Falguni?
Well, obviously, I do think the racial contract is very, very important. I don't think it's just a polemic, and especially for many of us who come out of a tradition of doing history of social contract theory. Like I said, in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, what's fascinating about that text is the ways in which that text illuminate a lot of everyday racial discourse that is often reduced to certain kinds of casual impulses and terminology. So, I mean, I think that's crucial. I agree. I think Blackness Visible is an excellent text as well, but he's also got a collection of essays in many different venues. So the companion, very old, but still a companion to African-American philosophy. He has in Contract and Domination with Carol Pateman, he has an essay on the domination contract, and he's really trying to work with Pateman there to think about how to expand some of these critical concepts to questions of settler colonialism and the violence engendered therein, work that actually in African-American studies has been taken up quite extensively. Obviously, I'm not in philosophy technically anymore. I'm in WGSS, but I'm still a philosopher as far as I can tell. And so I think it's really important to be able to communicate these kinds of discourses to those who are not philosophers, precisely because philosophers can be so off-putting and incomprehensible when they talk about race to those who don't necessarily have the same specialty and expertise and background that we do. So, so I would argue there's a number of different places. And I believe there's actually going to be, I think it's like charlesmills.com. There's there's going to be a website that actually accumulates many of his writings and, or at least a catalog of his writings so that people can actually access some of that there. So, I mean, he is he's very funny. There's an essay about, do Black men have an obligation to marry Black women, where, he's really kind of thinking about everyday problems that I think also quite incidentally, they touch on everyday questions that are like Fanon's discussion in Blacks Against White Masks, that really touch on questions of interracial relationships and the idea of being in bed with colonizers, and what kinds of racial complicity there is in interracial intimacies. So, Mills is really all over and in very profound ways, I think, beyond just the strictly professional philosophical.
Thanks. If you have any questions or, anecdotes you'd want to share from knowing Charles over the years, because I see there's many professors and former friends of his in the audience, please do let me know. I can also prompt the audience, the panel with another question, but I would like to answer your questions in the audience. Well, if we don't have any other questions, since many of the panelists know Charles very well, he had just, as many of you know, finished his book on basically his kind of argument for more Black radical liberalism. Do any of you have a sense of what Charles was working on at the time of his passing and where his work was going? He's just such a productive person. I couldn't imagine that he was ever going to hang it up. And so if you'd like to speak to that.
One of his, Chike Jeffers, who was one of his students, has been appointed the literary executor of his writings. And so he's actually going to be a wonderful, wonderful person to do it. And he's going to be compiling a bunch of his work that he was writing. I know he was in the middle of writing the Tanner lectures when he passed away, but I don't have much more information beyond that.
Yeah, we had just hosted one of the responses to the Tanners. I see we have a question from Jennifer Whiting.
It wasn't really a question, just a kind of comment about the value of the racial contract, even for people who prefer the Blackness Visible. And I think it fits a bit into some of the things that Professor Jagmohan was saying. So I once had a conversation with, we're almost exact contemporaries. We were, I was in graduate school at Cornell, at the time he was in graduate school in Toronto. And I had been inspired to go to graduate school by reading Rawls' Theory of Justice. And for me, Rawls was just, such a major figure. And I'm afraid that that's still very true in the kind of standard political philosophy courses that get taught in so many institutions like the one I teach in Pittsburgh. And so I think the resonances with the sexual contract with Carol Pateman, the way those things complement one another make the racial contract really a powerful book, even for more graduate students, people who would never be urged to read Carol Pateman in a philosophy department. So that's just it was just very interesting us comparing notes with each other about what our graduate student educations were like.
Thank you very much. Barbara Arnell, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks very much. And thanks everybody for the comments and very moving tributes and also insights into his work. I just very briefly wanted to say that I chaired the Lippincott Award this year for the American Political Science Association, and our committee awarded him the prize, and it is basically the Lifetime Achievement Award in political theory for political theorists. And I really think, I just want to kind of echo what Professor Sheth was saying about the importance of this work with respect to those of us who do history of political thought, and the idea of contract and the way in which it is racialized, gendered, and also I would say with respect to disability as well. It's an ableist contract too. So the contract stretches, I think, especially in American political thought, from Locke to Rawls, and who is included, who's excluded, and how they're excluded. And that, with respect to race, I think that speaks to indigenous peoples and land, as well as African Americans, labor, and slavery. So it's just a hugely important work, and I am glad he knew before he died that he had been given this award from those of us who learned so much from him.
Thank you. In the comments, someone asked a quite interesting question. When we generally talk about his kindness or friendship, we think of it as a kind of interpersonal quality, or a quality more in the private sphere. But the question is, how is both his friendship made any of you think about the ethics of friendship or the virtue of friendship, especially in public life and in the role as philosophers?
I'll just say a little bit on that. There is something, again, kind of hearkening back to how many people had incredibly generous engagements and interactions with Charles. That's why I don't feel very comfortable talking about my relationship, because I think he had so many deep friendships with people. But there was also something that was incredibly attractive and comforting about Charles's presence especially at conferences or at panels. There was, he was not a diva. He was incredibly approachable. He was always available to have a drink or to have dinner or to have lunch. He was always accessible for questions, to read manuscripts, to write letters of recommendation, and just incredibly humble. In so doing, he never, as far as I can tell from the hundreds of comments that I've heard from people over the multiple memorials over the last in the month and a half since he passed, it's very clear that no one ever felt like they were this peon in the face of a giant, even though I think at least we were, many of us were. And so in that sense, with regard to the ethics of friendship, the incredible unconditional generosity of Charles's friendship is not something that I have ever come across, or that I have come across very often. So I'll just say that much. Thanks for that question, Des.
mean, one of the things the question made me think about is when he writes in these kind of autobiographical essays, the way he reflects on some of the failures of the movements in the Caribbean and elsewhere as a sort of breakdown of trust. So, you know, part of the prompt, I think, is to think of friendship as just not just simply a quality of his character, but as something that was kind of part of his philosophical outlook and maybe even political ethos. But maybe it's something that he thought was just so intuitively obvious. He never really, you know, discussed necessarily its nature. But Linda, Professor Alcoff has a question, so please.
Hi, I just wanted to pick up real quick on a little point of disagreement perhaps between Professors Shelby and Sheth on the issue of the polemic idea, that the racial contract is a polemic. And I wanted to invite Tommy if you wanted to say more about that. I mean, it is a different kind of book. It's definitely a different kind. He's not working through the argument in the usual analytic philosophy way in the racial contract. So I was curious what you meant when you said that it was a polemic. I mean, sometimes that is a very negative term, but it doesn't need to be a negative term. So I wanted to pick up on that.
Thanks, Linda. Yeah, I didn't mean it negative at all. I just there are different ways of writing and different audiences that you might be aimed at. I mean, I say this as, you know, I think Derrick might have been at this dinner, I can't remember, but it was a dinner before the book came out. He had it in draft, and he was saying, "Oh, they're going to publish this book. We're talking about the book coming out," and he was like, he just really went for it, and the editor loved it because it was so unqualified. And he said he tried to pull it back in some ways. They're like, no, we want it like written like that. I just meant as a style of communication. It's a great book. And I think in a field like ours, it probably was needed in political philosophy at that time to have it written in that manner. My only point out with this, it does, I think, as Derrick was alluding to it, because of the title and the way it's engaged, it kind of leads you down the path to Rawls, and seeing it all as kind of in the shadow of Rawls's recuperation of the social contract theory and subsequent debates. And I was trying to respond to Des's point that, you know, that there is that, you can be led down that path very easily in that way, but there's this other work that doesn't necessarily rely so heavily on riffing on a social contract tradition and Rawls's defense of that tradition that can be found in these other essays, which don't rely as much on that, but make many of the same points, but also written in a way, I think, for people who don't need to be in any way convinced to take these things seriously, people who already take these things seriously, maybe even know something about them, and that those writings are well worth taking up, and I think shouldn't be just seen as all in the background or the shadow of the racial contract.
I'll only add here, I mean, one of the things that really stood out in his autobiographical reflections was that he had sent a 50,000 word piece to Cornell Press, and in response to Joe Wolf and Herb McGlary's comments, he went and he did a lot of footnotes and a kind of responding to a series of criticisms that would be raised. And as Tommy rightly pointed out, the editor said, no, we don't want that version. Let's go back to the original kind of more punchy version. But this is an appeal to whoever is curating his papers. I personally would like to see that version, actually. You know, if we're going to be historicizing Rawls and others, the moment will come we're historicizing thinkers in the 80s and 90s. And I think that would be incredibly important for thinking about the intellectual and historical reception of Mills. So if anyone has that version, it'd be really quite interesting to see how many of the criticisms of the social contract he anticipated, but actually did not publish. Josh, go ahead.
Yeah, this is fantastic. I really appreciate all the comments that everybody has made. One theme that's run through this is that Charles's movement from a more some kind of Marxist position to something that he thought of as a radical form of liberalism. And I wonder if any of you or all of you could say something about, we don't have much time left, but anyway, here's the, I wonder if you could say something about what do you think was the heart of his commitment to what he was calling liberalism? What was the central idea in that commitment? Because as you said, Tommy, this was not greeted universally with enthusiasm by people who were, you know, in agreement with him about lots of stuff and very influenced by him. So what's the nub of it?
You know, I guess I'll, now another way, I mean, there are a couple of ways to put that question. I mean, one way to put it, thinking about critics that Charles knew were lurking, you know, is you know, why seek to redeem liberalism, right? Why, especially after all this work you've given us, why even bother with it? And I mean, I think this is complicated. This is something that he said, is something I know he said maybe at places in his writing, but he doesn't emphasize it so much. One motivation, as people have pointed out, I mean, Charles was creating space to have conversations about things that philosophers weren't really talking about. And so he made some decisions about how to get the biggest spotlight put on bringing these issues into the mainstream. And I think it was a smart decision to do that by taking on a giant like Rawls, which he did. And he figured, look, if I can take on, it's one thing to talk about the history of the social contract tradition, Locke, Rousseau, and so forth, but that's, in a way, that's history. What can I talk about right now that would get people's attention? And so I think taking on Rawls was a way to get attention on these issues that he thought philosophy had long neglected. So that's one point. But then your question makes us ask, well, was it just purely a strategic move because he figured people would pay attention if you sort of find a big target to attack? Or was there some deeper commitment to liberalism? And I think probably the answer to that was yes, insofar as like who wouldn't be for respect for persons or equality or justice? Like if these were some of the grand ideals of liberalism, surely something we should be for those things, but we should think about all the ways in which those ideals have fallen short in the in America's racial polity. And so let's tell that story and then think about how to make it right. So I think there was a deep commitment to those liberal values, so to speak, and that motivated him to try to retool it. But to retool it, it had to be deracialized, as he would say, right? And so he set out to do that work. But I think even his critics would have a hard time saying that we shouldn't be concerned about some of those important normative concepts that have animated the liberal tradition.
Thanks.
Thanks. Since I generally couldn't agree more, and I couldn't add anything to that. Tommy, do you have a thought? And Bob and Falguni?
The only thing I would say, I mean, as I said it, and back and forth with Charles about Rawls and ideal theory, what didn't seem to be at issue was certain basic starting points about how to think about persons, as rational, free, and equal. He didn't seem to object to the principles that Rawls defends. He never says, if you take all these things into account, you'll find that you should reject the difference principle and accept this other principle. He doesn't do that. I mean, what he mostly does is he points out the necessity for theorizing how we should rectify injustices that these principles condemn. So there's not really detailed criticism of really core features of the liberal normative political philosophy, so far as I can tell, in his work. So I don't really see reason to see him as rejecting them. Of course, he might have a very different background, social theory coming out of Marxism. He might disagree about questions of political economy. Of course, Rawls, himself is open to a range of ways of realizing the principles, including liberal market socialism. So maybe Charles had disagreements about questions of political economy and what forms of political economy are really compatible with these principles, but I don't really see him attacking the principles themselves.
Yeah, and I don't have really much to add to what Tommy and Derrick had said. If you ask what's the nub, I would say it's the person sub-person distinction. That's the conceptual normative nub. If we're forced to to name a nub.
I'm fine. I agree with Bob on this one.
Great. Well, let's turn now. Thank you all for being here. And let's turn now to Maria, because I'm being told we have to wrap up.
You're on mute, Maria Clara. There you go.
Thank you, Josh.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone, for attending this virtual roundtable in honor of Charles Mills, and thank you to all our panelists for your thoughtful comments. Supporting readers of Boston Review are critical to the effort of providing free access to all our online content and to help fund events like this. So if you haven't already done so, please consider making a small contribution of any amount so you can help fund future events like this and the work of Boston Review through the link in the chat. Thank you once again, and we will post the recording of this event in the coming weeks.
Thank you. Thank you again, Maria, for all your work.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Much.